Well, welcome back for our lunchtime discussion. My name is Dr. Rebecca Klaper. I'm a professor and the interim dean at the School of Freshwater Sciences at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We're the first. Thank you. Of course, that's one of our students down here that's making the moves on. We're the first school of freshwater sciences, a school just dedicated to freshwater sciences, and which we're very excited about. Prior to this, we were a research institute, so we've been around since about 1965, doing work on the Great Lakes and freshwater sciences here in Wisconsin and internationally. Our group does research on everything from aquaculture to ecosystem services to environmental health and toxicology. And you'll see representatives from our school here today in the form of our faculty who students have posters outside in each of those different areas. And then also students and our alumni, which are scattered throughout the audience I've seen in various positions. Our school, which we started back in 2012, has a PhD and master's program, traditional thesis and PhD programs, and then also a professional master's of science. And our students, we have a 95% placement rate over our last 10 years of students into everything from academia to government to nonprofits, federal agencies, and industry as well, water industries. And so we're very proud of our alumni, and some of them are employed by you all out here in the audience as I see them as great representatives of our school here today. And I encourage you, we would love to make partnerships with more organizations to place our students as they graduate and also through internships. We have a new undergrad program that just started this last year that was in high demand. We have a major request for our Bachelor's of Science program. And so we would love to place undergrad as well as our graduate students as interns in your organizations so they can learn more directly about how they can use their education in freshwater science. From the inception of our program, we realized that the human component is a huge part of the solution in our freshwater issues. And so we wanted to take our science, and as one of the questions earlier in the session asked, how do you take science and place it into a public policy realm and make a difference? And one of the ways is through, we hired several social scientists, economists, and created the Center for Water Policy, which has hosted this meeting here today, and we're very proud of. And as a consequence, we hired Melissa Scanlan as our director of our Center for Water Policy, who's done a great job of organizing this conference with her staff today, and I'd just like to say thank you for this wonderful meeting that we've had. It's a really great way of bringing everyone together for a conversation around what this important topic means and what we can do about it. Just to introduce Melissa, who many of you already know, she's the founder of a variety of enterprises before being our director of the Center for Water Policy, including Midwest Environmental Advocates, which was a nonprofit environmental law firm here in Madison. And from there, she was the associate dean at University of Vermont in the law school, and then came to us from that prestigious position. And her current work includes law and policy research on issues of environmental justice, water infrastructure, and water pollution. And she'll be leading the discussion today with our esteemed speaker, Dan Egan, who is a best-selling author and environmental journalist, and who'll deliver our keynote address today. And I think many of us are really excited about his new book that will be coming out very shortly, which you can see a copy of out front, about phosphorus. He, along with several others, but Dan is an esteemed Brico Fund journalist in residence at our Center for Water Policy. So we've had several fellows that embedded within our school that are basically take our science and take our school into another realm. And so we're very excited about Dan being part of our school. Prior to this position, Dan was a reporter with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, covering Great Lakes from 2002 until 2021, where he published a fantastic book on the Great Lakes. He's a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and has won the Alfred DuPont Columbia University Award and the John B. Oakes Award and the American Association for the Advancement of Science Kavli Science Journalism Award, as well as the Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award. So very esteemed journalist and writer. Dan will speak today on his forthcoming book, The Devil's Element, Phosphorus and a World Out of Balance. So let's all welcome our speaker today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I just got to show Dan his book. This is the first time he's held the hard copy, so
it's like a baby.
Very exciting. You wrote a very well-received book on the Great Lakes. I know a lot of people have probably read The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. Who's read that book? Yes. So many accolades for that book, but I think the best part that I saw on it was you appearing on The Daily Show, making the comedy circuit with Trevor Noah. And with a title like The Devil's Element, do you think you're up for the comedy circuit again?
I don't know, I had a lot of family and friends who didn't understand what that whole show was about, and they were upset that I was duped in such a fashion. And I had to explain, I think that clip lasted like 5 minutes, but we spent 8 or 9 hours down in Chicago shooting it because we just kept laughing so much. And actually, I think my book agent or editor, I can't remember, they weren't thrilled that I did it, but I had fun, and my whole point was just to get the word out, even if it's kind of a non-traditional way, just to get people thinking and talking about the Great Lakes. So
yeah, absolutely.
I'd go back.
And you probably have some fodder in here for it too. Like, how about your attempt to use an 18th century recipe that provides step-by-step instructions for coaxing elemental phosphorus from your human urine?
Not just my human urine. I've got a lot of beer drinking friends, and no, I hoped to open the book recreating the alchemy that was done in, I think, 1669 when this guy cooked it out of a bunch of urine in Hamburg, Germany. And I have a turkey fryer, some safety goggles, a father-in-law who's now deceased, but he's a chemical engineer. And I thought I would give it a go, and if I failed, it would at least be an entertaining way to open up a book that isn't about the sexiest topic. No offense to everybody here, but a lot of people in the public don't share our passion for the element yet. Anyway, I wrote a guy at Johns Hopkins University who specialized in recreating these old experiments, and he just cautioned me. He said, well, first of all, you can't get the stuff hot enough. We don't have the earthenware that they did back in the 1600s, and even if you did start getting close, it's really dangerous and combustible. And he said that this is his career, he said that he actually tried it once and it didn't work, and he wouldn't think about doing it again. So that was just one of the stumbling blocks that I ran into on the odyssey of this book, but I did at least get to mention it, and gets people thinking about waste in a different way.
It sure does. That and the cartoon character Urination, who I'm just going to leave it there. People can read the book to find out about that. So you open the Devil's Element with all sorts of relatable stories about people who get acutely sick from contact with toxic algae while trying to do things like, outrun the police. Yeah. There are emergency room visits for people with respiratory and GI illnesses, fisheries collapsing due to dead zones caused by decomposing algae. You make it really interesting to follow this. And I'm pretty convinced you can take the most seemingly bland topic and make it captivating from reading this book. So with all that talent, why did you choose phosphorus as the focus of this book, as opposed to any other topic you might choose?
Okay, right before I answer that, I just want to take a picture of all the people who are interested in phosphorus, because it's great. I got interested in phosphorus when I was writing the Great Lakes book, and I had a chapter on Lake Erie and the algae troubles that they were having. And I remember thinking when I was writing the Great Lakes book, it was largely repurposed material from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel that I had compiled over like 10 years. So I was repurposing it into a new product, but it wasn't all entirely new. It was like rehabbing a house, and it was very frustrating at times when I was thinking, I wish I could just start a book from scratch and not have, because I'd be editing through some of this old material and I'd take it out and then I'd be like, well, that was a load-bearing wall. It needed to be in there. Otherwise, this doesn't make sense. Why can't I start one from scratch? And So when the Great Lakes book came out and it was doing pretty well, the publisher said, are there any other topics that you'd like to write about? And I said, yeah, phosphorus. I mean, when I was researching it, I thought it was way more interesting than the story of the Great Lakes. And it took about 2 years to sell that Great Lakes book to a publisher, to get a publisher to bite. And this took like 3 weeks. And so then I got what I wished for. And yeah, it's been fun, but it wasn't as much fun as I thought it was going to be. A lot of work.
It was a lot of work.
A lot of work.
Yeah. And you describe phosphorus as having this dual nature, being both essential for our cells and food supply, and then causing these toxic and harmful effects when it's in the wrong place, wrong quantity, feeding toxic blue-green algae. And so let's talk a bit about that dual nature. I mean, part of the book message that I saw was you laying out the case for the scarcity of phosphorus and how this might impact our food supply in the future. So do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think in the book it's referred to as the phosphorus paradox, how, this is not news to anybody in this room, but we're burning through it pretty fast and sometimes to disastrous effect. So it's something we're going to run out of at some point in some fashion or run scarce on. At the same time, we are manifestly overusing it to the point where, you go down to the terrace on a summer night and you see that empty, or summer afternoon, and you see the empty lifeguard chair because there's nobody in there because that beach is smothered in, phosphorus-driven goop. So yeah, there really is. It's a precarious relationship that we have with it. We need it, and we need to stop using so much of it. And so I kind of explore that. And I don't make the argument in this book that we're going to run out of phosphorus in 30 years or even 100 years. But I think the U.S. reserves we're exploiting them at a pace. Now, they may find more, but it's also getting more and more difficult to mine down in Florida. But we're looking at a horizon of like a half century maybe, at which point we become more dependent on other countries for our food supply. So you think about energy security, I think nutritional security is probably trumps that. And not only do we have to worry about the U.S. reserves running low, we have to think about where the remaining ones are. And it's widely known that 70 to 80% of the remaining reserves are in Morocco and Western Sahara, and they may or may not have the same interest in putting food on the table, our tables, that we do. So, and that's just our dynamic with that region. When you think of it globally, it could be a source of a lot of tension. And yeah, this is, when I'm talking about these issues in the book, I don't have any answers. I'm just trying to open eyes and get people to start thinking about, like, the system we have right now is humming along, algae outbreaks notwithstanding, but it can't sustain. It just can't. We took the circle, the virtuous circle of life, stitched together by phosphorus, and cracked it and straightened it out and turned it into a line that runs into Lake Mendota and any other lake you can think of.
Yeah, before this session, we were hearing from the other panel talking about how leaky our system is. And I think you're writing about the scarcity of phosphorus and how that ties into chemically charged fertilizers, right? Makes us have to think more closely about having a leaky system and why we're wasting so much of it. I think I think you give a 30-year time horizon for the Florida supply. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely close. Now, I love the phrasing of so many things in your book. I want to pivot to talking more about the excess problem of phosphorus getting into the water supply. And you write, in exchange for breaking the natural throttle that limited how many humans Earth could sustain, we're polluting fresh waters with phosphorus fertilizer to the point those waters are increasingly prone to be too foul to swim in, to fish upon, and to drink from. And there you're really tying together the fact that we needed to increase productivity on farmland in order to feed so many people on Earth. And so how are we going to continue to have a food supply that supports this population but isn't wasting so much by having it run off? What do you see are some of the major drivers really causing us to essentially waste phosphorus and overuse it?
Just expedience. I mean, it's relatively cheap, and so that's the system that we've been relying on. Use it once and toss it. And like I said, that just can't last. And we're going to have to start thinking about our wastes, both human waste, but more significantly agriculture waste as an asset. And you know, they were worried that we weren't going to be able to sustain, I don't remember the number, in 1900, like 1.5 billion people or something. And then the Haber-Bosch, if that's how you pronounce it, process solved the nitrogen limitation problem. And these rock mines solved the phosphorus problem. The difference is that we're really not going to run out of nitrogen anytime soon. And again, it's not like we're going to run completely, because it doesn't disappear. It just goes into our water and becomes a problem instead of an asset. And it's now we have, what, 8 billion? We're on our way to 9 billion. And how are we going to sustain this? I don't think, I mean, I'm no futurist, but I don't think we do sustain it in the way that we're going right now. And the first thing, obviously, you want to do is go after this low-hanging fruit. And the first thing that comes to my mind is ethanol. You know, it's crazy. It's crazy that 40% of the corn that we're growing is ending up in our fuel tanks to dubious benefit. That's a solvable problem real quickly. And you know, I do have a section in the book where I go to the Iowa State Fair where all the presidential hopefuls hop up on they call it a soapbox, and it's smaller than this stage here. And there's fewer people typically than there are in this room. And you get all the presidential candidates coming through, and they all have to bow to the ethanol god if they want to show well in Iowa. And that's critical because that's the first, you know, it's the caucuses, it's not a primary, but that's the first contest in the cycle. So every candidate, you know, regardless of political affiliation, goes into Iowa saying how much they value ethanol. And that, to me, is just fixable, but it's tragic. It's crazy.
So moving that first one to South Carolina is going to impact ethanol?
Moving that, yeah. So that's happening on the Democrat side, and I don't know. I mean, I do know that if people, there aren't a lot of solutions in this book, as I said earlier. It's more to just raise public awareness, but if there is one easy solution, it's to really rethink, you know, what we're using this fertilizer on. And it's corn, but that's not corn that we're sitting here eating today. It's corn that we're driving around and burning and fouling our engines, and yeah.
So you say you're not really talking too much about solutions in the book, but you do talk about some success stories. So the original problem of phosphorus driving algae due to detergent with phosphorus in it, that was solved. And do you see that as holding any kind of lessons for us for how to deal with this next wave of phosphorus troubles that we're facing right now from agriculture?
I think the biggest lesson we could take is that their successes are possible. And you know, that was a dramatic success, and it happened real fast. Unfortunately, the fix that we're in right now isn't the same. It's not going to be solved in the same way or as quickly. And you know, we can start land use restrictions or regulations, better regulating what's going on and what's coming off. More importantly, what's coming off farm fields by looking at, you know, how the Clean Water Act is or isn't working for this non-point pollution. But even if we stopped the flow today, like in 1974, 75. When they pulled phosphates from most detergents, Lake Erie was a mess. It was a mess for a number of reasons, but phosphorus was a big reason. And within 10 years, I have a episode in the Great Lakes book where Dr. Seuss in the Lorax took a whack at Lake Erie in one of his rhymes, his couplets, and it was, funny, but it wasn't true by 1985, and he pulled it. And so, that's a great success story. We're going to have to recalibrate our expectations this time around, but that doesn't mean that you just throw in the towel, because there's other things that are going to necessitate that we do this. But you think about the legacy phosphorus that's not just on the land, it's in the sediment, in the waters. I mean, we've really, when you think about what we've done in the last 120 years, we opened a gusher to magnificent effect. I mean, it's been estimated, I think 50% of our food is coming from mined phosphorus, which is fantastic, but it just can't last. And so it gets a little depressing writing about this in some ways, but the struggle is worth it. We know more, and we're developing better technologies, and we should start looking at what we're growing, but also what we're throwing away in manure. And I know it's often applied as a fertilizer on farm fields, but it's not being precisely applied, or we would not have Lake Erie, choking every summer, and these toxic algae slicks that span hundreds, if not thousands, of square miles. The farm industry can say that they're doing a lot. They've got their H2O water, I can't remember. They've got a campaign over there to be better stewards, better farmers, and it is manifestly not working because the lake is severely messed up. And so we need to look at manure as an asset rather than something to be disposed of. And I think that will only come about through technology, figuring out, how to strip what we want out of it, the phosphorus. There was a story in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel last fall. They were talking about the methane because of the tax credits coming out of California. There are farmers who can make more for their methane than their milk. So the product becomes manure in some ways. And that's kind of horrifying, but it's also enticing. It's like, well, now we're starting to see it for what it is, and it's an asset that needs to be recycled, and not just reused once, but it just needs to be used over and over and over, because that's what these molecules are nature built to do.
I thought that was actually one of the possibly interesting solutions from your book, although it would continue to entrench us in using, encouraging concentrated livestock facilities, but it is a solution.
Sure.
And it is a potentially game-changing solution, right, that the California carbon market has opened up.
Well, yeah, and I'm agnostic on CAFOs because I don't think we need as much milk as we're producing, but that's another story. But with the CAFOs, when the Clean Water Act exempted agriculture, the idea at the time, and somebody can jump in and correct me if I'm completely wrong here, but it was that these farms, the waste is so diffuse, and the farm operators are so small, and what's measurable is so difficult. It's difficult to measure anything. Like, you can cap a smokestack, you can plug a pipe, but you can't squeegee a farm field of its excess wastes. But now you can, because the CAFOs, one of the big principles of waste management is consolidating it. And these CAFOs are doing that in those sewage lagoons, which are point source polluters. Now, there is the step they can take where they move it off away from those industrial facilities of the CAFO onto neighboring lands, oftentimes not their own lands, and it just gets spread. We can do more once we get that sewage in those lagoons. And I'm not, like I said, I'll say it about 5 more times, I'm not offering prescriptions here. I'm just planting seeds and ideas. But it does seem that a big step to solving this problem is concentrating the waste, and that's what's happening in these concentrated animal feeding operations.
Yeah, you talk about how much of the phosphorus now washing off ag lands hits Lake Erie and other lakes in a super potent dissolved form. And you're essentially, I think, tying it back to CAFOs that are spreading liquid manure, right? And one of the things that I think is key to understanding that you pull out in the book is how that's feeding toxic blue-green algae outbreaks, and how that's also tied back specifically to the work that you were doing on invasive species. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about the invasive mussels and in the Great Lakes that the School of Freshwater Sciences has been doing a lot of research on.
Yeah, I mean, the mussels, they're brainless. I remember writing in the Great Lakes book, they're brainless, but they're smart enough not to eat microcystis. And so you can see these YouTube videos of these bivalves in aquariums, and I guess it's aquaria if I'm in a crowd like this. But spitting out, they're siphoning everything out of the water and then spitting out the microcystis. And so they're basically selecting for microcystis, which is thriving. So now when you have an outbreak of algae, it's more likely in certain bodies of water to be green algae, blue-green algae, than it would have been in years past. But there are other things driving this too. I think we talked a little bit about this a couple days ago, but I think more carbon in the air is probably helping to enhance the blooms, temperatures, and maybe weather patterns. I mean, so it's a bugaboo. I mean, when we were talking about algae outbreaks in the 1960s, it wasn't this stuff that is so potentially menacing, because there's more and more studies coming out about what chronic and acute exposure to like microcystin, one of the toxins produced by microcystis, and it's produced by other types of blue-green algae. It can, it's bad, really bad for your liver. It's death for your dogs sometimes. And there's some concern emerging that could be associated with these neurological diseases that are spiking around lakes that have chronic algae outbreaks. And so it's still, I address this in the book, and it's new, and there's no causation. There's some correlation right now, but there's reason to be concerned. And I find this interesting because I go down to Florida a number of times in this book, and to see people at these citizen meetings, they're not environmentalists. They're not worried about saving the Everglades. They're worried about getting another CAT scan because they can't hold down food. And I talked to this guy who said he hadn't eaten anything but Tums for 3 days, and he had an office on a canal in, I think it was St. Lucie, Florida. And I went over to that office, and the gunk on that canal was so thick, there was like an armadillo or something toddling across it. I mean, he was walking on water, and the stench was just, putrid. So this is an issue, though, that isn't some abstract environmental issue. It's not like we're trying to preserve, tundra in Alaska or something. It's coming down to preserving ourselves.
Yeah, and it seems, you have gripping stories about that in your book, and I think it opens up a research question for the group about whether or not this is, these anecdotes are showing the worst cases, or is this happening more frequently, and why is that? Because the mussels explain it partially, but there are all these different factors that probably need to be understood, and it does have this serious public health impact.
Yeah, I think it's a ripe field for more research. I also think people are more in tune with it and aware of what's going on than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So yeah, I'll be the first to say that there's some sensational stories in this, but they're sensational. I mean, Well, it starts with this guy who's being chased by the police, and he gets pulled over, and he's got some drugs on him, and he goes into the neighborhoods of Cape Coral and jumps into a canal and just starts vomiting and, starts drowning. And he was able to dog paddle to shore. This is all on body cam footage from the police. They're not going in. They're like, let's get a rope, let's get a raft. But they're telling him, this is going to kill you. And he gets out and he's just vomiting over and over and over again. And that made me just think, like, welcome. And I talked to a number of people that summer in the Fort Myers area, and the problem is coming from the middle of the state. It comes from Lake Okeechobee. They send down these these flows just loaded with toxic algae, driven by all the phosphorus being used in the middle of the state. And they used to happen once in a while, and now they're happening almost every year. Now they're happening longer, and it's kind of a bleak future when you. And it's not all bad. I mean, you go to Florida, and 90% of the time have a great time. But I think it's reasonable to have a expectation that you can go to Florida and swim at the beach and not get lucky to be able to swim at the beach. Great Lakes and Lake Mendota as well. Any water. That's kind of the point of the Clean Water Act, isn't it?
That's right. And speaking of different legal frameworks, and you write about how in 2018, the US and Canadian governments reached an agreement to slash annual phosphorus flow into Lake Erie by 40% by 2025. So that's just around the corner. But how are we doing?
I don't know where we are, but we're not close to it. Yeah, I mean, the thing about what happened in the 1960s and 70s is there were teeth to these things, and there aren't now. There aren't. And, it's always the carrot or the stick. Like, we can do this cooperatively. It's like we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Well, the easy way isn't working. It's not. And,
Are you calling the easy way the voluntary way?
Yes, yeah, I should be more clear. But it isn't working, and we're paying a price for the broken system, whether we realize it or not. I mean, milk may be really cheap, but there's a real price to not being able to swim in your lake, and so that's a cost that doesn't appear on a spreadsheet, but it's sweeping, and it's affects our whole culture.
Yeah, and going back to the toxic algae, it's not just swimming in your lake, but drinking the water out of it. You have a story about Toledo having to shut down their drinking water supply, and that they couldn't even boil this stuff.
Yeah, and that I think was 2014, and that's kind of a famous case. And people, I remember at the time they were thinking, what's it going to take to wake? I was down there the week that happened, coincidentally. Literally, I was down there to do a story on this, and I got home on a Friday, and on Saturday, they had to, it wasn't technically a closure, it was just a do not drink, do not touch advisory. And people were saying when I was down there talking about because there had been some smaller communities in western Lake Erie that had lost their water for some number of days. And they were saying, it's going to take a major city losing its water for us to have our modern Cuyahoga moment when people say, enough's enough. We live on the shore of 20% of the world's fresh surface water, and we're getting baby formula delivered by the National Guard, and, water coming in on trucks by the pallet. That's too much. And so I remember the mayors of the Great Lakes cities met at the Shed Aquarium to much fanfare, and they vowed that they would change things. And they have changed things. I mean, what they're doing is getting better at treating the water, which is a good idea. But again, it's the symptom, and the problem's not getting any better.
So we're going to open it up to questions from the audience soon. So be thinking about them and get ready to come up to the mic. We'll turn it around so you don't have to come up on the stage. So I do want to get to not just focus on agriculture, but sewage treatment. And you do have a solution story from Germany. So maybe you want to touch on what they're doing in Germany.
Yeah, Hamburg, Germany figures prominently in the book because this alchemist who discovered phosphorus by cooking it from his urine and his friend's urine. There's a lot of it. That happened in Hamburg, and then so the book kind of opens. The introduction is this guy getting chased by the police and jumping in the goop, but then chapter 1 opens with this guy on the Baltic Sea hunting for amber. Baltic amber is a well-known product because that used to be a conifer forest up there, and all the resin left all this amber. And so people scour the beaches and pick it up for their own use and to sell. And this guy was picking stuff up for his own use, and he found something that he thought was a pebble of amber, and he put it in his pocket. And then about 5 minutes later, his leg exploded, or the fire just burst because elemental phosphorus, once it's conjured into the world, because it's almost always bound with oxygen atoms to create phosphates, which aren't as unstable as elemental phosphorus. If it gets to above about 80 Fahrenheit, it combusts, and then it'll burn. For this guy, I mean, the book doesn't have pictures, probably good, but this guy's leg was just, it looked like tree bark from all the graphs. And it was there in that water or on the beach because in 1943, once the Allies got their air power together, they took it back to the Germans, and it was like Dresden and Hamburg. It's not as well known, but they burned the city down largely with phosphorus bombs. And so these globules of white phosphorus raining out of the sky, when they hit the water, they kind of got frozen in time because they went out. And so they're just there lurking in the waters on the Elbe River and a nearby Baltic Sea. And people, it's not that uncommon. You can Google it and see stories, tales of woe for these people who were getting burned. So that got me interested in Hamburg. I never know whether they're called Hamburg or it sounds in Hamburg. And then, you know, a book is heavy as this, it has to have some optimism in it. And just coincidentally, I knew that Germany had passed some really strict phosphorus recovery standards for the human waste stream. And it turns out that in Hamburg, they have a state-of-the-art phosphorus capturing technology that they expect to be used nationwide. Not that one necessarily, but they had like a pilot plant. That's what I saw when I was there in 2019. And last I heard, this fall, they were about to go fully online, and they believe they can get essentially all of the phosphorus out of the human waste stream, which is great. But and I think that, you know, Germany's good at a lot of things, and that's one of them. And I think that hopefully that'll spread. And but the lower hanging fruit still is all that manure, animal manure.
All right. Why don't we start lining up people who want to ask questions? And while you're lining up, I will give you the quote from the Lorax that Dan was searching for from the 1971 Dr. Seuss. They'll walk on their fins and get woefully weary in search of some water that isn't so smeary. I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Erie. That's the part that got removed, right?
Yeah, in 1985, a couple of graduate students from Ohio State wrote, I think his name's Theodore Gissel, Dr. Seuss, and said, hey, you got to come up to Lake Erie and check it out. And he wrote back in a very Seussian fashion that he was quite busy, but he's read about the remarkable things and that he would henceforth pull that line from the book, and he did. But he should probably put it back now.
Yeah. Why don't you write him?
He's gone.
Can you hear? Yeah. Thanks for your work. Love the Great Lakes book, by the way. So all of us who work in this world find ourselves getting really depressed unless we compartmentalize it really closely, because as we talked about, all the systems are pushing against this, including your 8 to 9 billion to 10 to wherever we end up, right? So it's pretty terrifying. You have a son, I think a similar age to my son. He's also faced with climate change and all the other garbage out there. What do you tell your son?
Well, if I could get him to read the book, he might get concerned. But no. No, that's a good question. But you know, we're all doomed anyway. We're doomed. We're doomed from the day we're born. I mean, whether we're born into a pristine environment or not. And life is the struggle, and this I think is one element of that element. There are things we can do, and there are reasons to be optimistic. We're all going to die, but that doesn't mean that I can eat corned beef for dinner every night. I guess I could, but no. You have a responsibility to take care of I think your own health and of the greater health of the planet and our regional and local environments. So what do I tell my kids? I seriously, I tell them to swim in Lake Michigan every time it gets above 62 or 63 degrees, so they can have an appreciation for it and a sense of stewardship for it. And I think one of the problems here with this phosphorus issue is that it's just been out of sight, out of mind for so long that we're just kind of waking up and thinking, whoa, we're gonna run out of fuel here, food fuel. That's the first step. So, but yeah, it's and I try to in this book. When I first started writing it, and people were asking me what I was writing, and I said a book about phosphorus, and they looked at me like I was just diagnosed with something bad, and and I know that it's kind of a heavy topic, but if it wasn't phosphorus, it'd be something else that we'd be in this room talking about. So this is one of our modern problems that we have to begin to address. And that's what my son is 16, and yeah, I'm confident that he'll have food on his table and be able to swim in Lake Michigan when he's my age. I'm hopeful.
Great. Other people? Folks are shy at lunch. Oh, I know there has to be more questions for our author. Here we go.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I guess maybe a question for you, but also for the broader audience. And I work for the DNR. I implement the Clean Water Act in the southern third of the state. I would encourage people to go out and look at the posters. There's a really nice poster that shows all of our long-term trend data for our monitoring sites in Wisconsin. Most of our sites show a significant decline in phosphorus in our rivers, including the Rock River, numerous locations, the Sugar River, predominantly agricultural watersheds. We can account for the reductions from point sources, and we can also show that a huge amount of reduction has come from reductions from agriculture. One thing I think that you touched on, which I really appreciated hearing, was the idea of legacy phosphorus. That's a big issue in our region. It's a big issue with wetlands. And that, I think, is going to be one of our big challenges going forward. And I guess just from the work that you've done, have you seen kind of examples from other areas where people have addressed that or approaches they've used?
No, as a journalist, and you raise a great point. We're more prone to, when things are working well, that's not news. It's when things aren't working well. And every example in a watershed, up in Green Bay with New Water, and what they're doing up there, people need to know about that. They need a map. They need a game plan, so they can start moving forward. But at the same time, there's a lot of watersheds that are, it's not getting better, it's getting worse. The Maumee watershed, I think I was over. Every year, it's become as predictable as foliage when the bloom's going to come. And so every June or early July, they have a meeting over in Western Lake Erie and talk about predict the severity of the bloom that's coming. Well, the year that I was over there, they were talking about, yeah, you know, it had been really wet spring, so a lot of fertilizer didn't get applied, and they were confident that, you know, they were going to have a 7 out of 10 on the Bloom scale. And nobody in the room talked about that that week there was 4,000 head hog CAFO approved for inside the basin. So if this book probably is lacking some success stories, because we do need people to see a roadmap forward, but we also need to stop making it worse. That's the first step. So I don't know if that's a thorough answer to your question, but it's the best I got right now.
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions.
So I'll just hold it like this. Part of your stories are always about the public perception. Do you see a link when you've talked to not just the mayors, but the general populace about a link between the phosphorus issue and algae, or is it kind of oblivion for the most part?
Yeah, no, I think I hope this is one of the purposes of this book, is to open people's eyes, because lay people don't make that connection at all. You know, they don't even think about fertilizer and the whole system, and how that market can be very volatile. Like in 2008, I guess people started thinking about it when there were food riots around the world, because the prices of phosphate just spiked. I can't remember, you know, what the numbers were, but they were severe. But it's hard to, you know, it's just like invasive species. When you go to an inland lake and, you know, you try to explain to somebody why they have to wear aqua socks or why they have to take antibiotics because their feet are all cut up, it's because of the shipping industry bringing in all these exotic creatures into the Great Lakes that then spread, metastasize inland. So no, I don't think there's a lot of public awareness out there, and that's one of the goals of the book.
Thanks for the conversation. My name's Peter Burrows. I work with Wisconsin Conservation Voters, which is an environmental nonprofit focused on engaging voters to protect the environment. And today's the first day of early voting for the spring Wisconsin Supreme Court election. And I guess I'm curious, in your writing, if you talked at all about the implications of the courts over the past decade or longer, and any thoughts on how they might impact this work moving forward.
Not really, I'm sorry. But no, I do know that Ohio's under pressure because of some court cases to, you know, they weren't even, Western Lake Erie, the basin of Western Lake Erie wasn't even declared impaired until a couple of years ago, I believe. I mean, it's hard to even call some of that stuff water. You go to Maumee Bay State Park, and there's way more signs telling people not to swim or to be careful swimming than there are swimmers. And it's taken legal action just to make these baby steps. And no, I mean, courts should be the last recourse, but they are one. And you know, that's one way forward. But you know, one of the things too is you don't want to demonize farmers at all, because they're just operating in the system that's been set up for them, for good and ill. And you can't. They're businessmen and women, and they're not getting. Most of them are not getting rich doing this hard, necessary work. But it's the system, and that's what's got to change. And if it changes things on an even playing field, well, yeah, maybe the price of milk does go up a bit, but that's a price we're paying, as I said earlier, in the form of polluted waters. So, yeah, I mean, we need a better system. I don't know if we're going to get there voluntarily, but I wish I would have made this point earlier about the farmers too, because I do respect the heck out of what they're doing, and I do understand that they can't just single-handedly solve the problem. They need a system that works better for the environment and well for them.
Yeah, so isn't a part of that what's being driven by the Farm Bill and what's being subsidized?
Yeah. And let's go back to ethanol too.
All right, I have just a few comments. I couldn't agree more with you that manure is an asset, and being able to look at it like that and what it brings in value And I think that, as we look at different ways to fix the system, right, whether we're looking at more grassland opportunities or looking at, you mentioned the carbon market with California, that window's closing pretty quick here. I don't think farms are going to have the opportunity to continue to do that because we need to keep all of our credits in our food system and in a vertical system. Selling them to California is not going to do anything for the state or do anything long term. So looking for a solution, whether that's putting in a biodigester and being able to sell it back on the grid and having opportunities like that, I think having a multi-pronged approach, right? Like a biodigester is not feasible for anyone under 2,000 cows. That's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. So we need to find solutions for people that are, still at the smaller scale, some in the middle, and some at the long-term scale. And I think being able to be open-minded about that is going to be crucial to moving forward with the benefits. And side note, you guys got to hang out with more farmers. We are way more positive than you guys.
Thank you for those comments.
All right, we've got time for one more question.
I want to go back to the scale question. You're saying, well, it's kind of handy if we can collectivize our nutrients. And the bigger in certain ways is better. I guess I feel like this is maybe an example of a specific issue blinding us to the bigger picture. If you look at rural communities and what they require more farmers. They require more farms. They require more atomized production that more businesses can engage in servicing. And I think it's important for us to identify if that squeegee approach, if that approach to having it collectivized so we can deal with it properly, looks like the only solution. I think we need to reframe the question. Because I don't think it's the only solution, and I think we ought to be looking at how can we address phosphorus while supporting communities at a scale that's actually healthy for the country, that's healthy for communities, that's healthy for our culture.
Yeah, that's not a question. That's just a really good statement. And I appreciate it. Yeah, culturally in Wisconsin too, it is, you just drive on I-43, for example, you get north of Port Washington and just the barns, the family farms are, they've been replaced by the big operators. And that not only has environmental impacts, but it has cultural impacts too. And we were humming along pretty good in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And I think most people, in the abstract at least, like the idea of small-scale farm operators. Again, it goes to the systems that are set up. And you're right. If you look at CAFOs and only see from the angle of what are we going to do with these mounds of sewage sludge and the phosphorus specifically, that doesn't solve some of the bigger issues at hand. And somebody else can write that book. So.
Okay, if there's one last message you want to leave with the audience, what would it be?
Don't despair. Is it too late to say that? No, it's just the first, you guys in this room, you're a self-selected group who know a lot about this issue, but be evangelized, let people, who don't make this their life's work, understand what's going on, and that, there are opportunities for everything to move in a better direction, not just in terms of water quality, but in terms of agriculture production. And the first step is just awareness, and that's the step that I'm trying to take with this book.
Thanks, Dan. That's great.